a nice little case study to share with you today. This is a 250-word story for a Halloween origin story contest. And currently, there are several issues that I have to deal with here. The big one is that this draft sits at 373 words, significantly too many. So we're going to have to look at some structural edits, and then we're going to try to get very precise. We're going to look at the lines. We're going to see if there's opportunities to improve sentence structure, diction, imagery. How precise can we get with this thing? If you're new to the channel, welcome. So here's the story. Let us get started. Just some brass tacks, pragmatic stuff in the corner here. Halloween origin story V1. Before I even start, I'm going to make a copy of this document so that I preserve everything that I've written in the first draft, so that in case I regret changes, I can go back and have a clean copy. You'll see here that currently this story is untitled. That is another goal of this sort of revising session. This particular story is due. I need to submit it within 24 hours, more or less. So we've got to come up with a title as well, so that we're on the same page in case you're listening to this, and just more broadly to get a sense of the story that we're starting with before we try to gut it, before we try to sculpt it, improve it. I'm going to read this story aloud. This is just going to take a minute. It's a really short story. Here we go. After the incident with the Kelly twins, Mark Holman, a 57-year-old butcher, tried to have Halloween banned in his normally sleepy town of Landon, Connecticut. The Kelly twins had knifed each other to death with cheap plastic pumpkin carving knives. Those boys had been at each other since the womb, so while everyone thought the deaths were horrific, most were not entirely surprised. But Holman, who had been using the very same brand and model of carving knife in his butcher shop for a decade, knew the knives were marked, and knew that some malevolent force had not only instigated the double murder, but had also redirected his son Little Tim's carving hand, which had been moving towards his jack-o'-lantern's mouth, to his finger, which he severed off. And what happened when he delivered a roast to the Perkins home while Grace Perkin was trying on her caterpillar costume, well, it was unspeakable. Holman confessed to the mayor that for years he'd known that the inordinately sharp carving knives, which he inexplicably managed to cleave grisly stew meat with, held dark energy. Sometimes he would arrive in the shop to find all his steaks already filleted. Usually his cat handled the mice, but sometimes he found them with their throats slit. Every year, the knives grew sharper. After Holman made such a fuss, some folks stopped coming to his shop. But he stayed in business, and the next year he waited with dread as Halloween approached. He'd long thrown out his own set of knives, but at the dollar store he saw mothers and children plucking them off the rack by the handful. He didn't dare stop them, but he stayed up night after night wishing he had. Then, on Halloween, he found one of his old knives under his pillow. He took it and held it the way he did when the twins had come into his shop looking for fresh ground sausage. The way he held it when he had helped little Tim with the jack-o'-lantern smile. As he stabbed himself again and again, he thought, as he had with Grace, that butterflies are so much more beautiful than caterpillars. They didn't ban Halloween in Landon, but they banned jack-o'-lanterns. The streets are darker now. So that's what we're dealing with. There are things that I like. I like the basic frame. I like the beginning and end. I like the twist. So by and large, we're dealing with a story that the engine works, there's propulsion, we have a clear character, a clear world, but we have many words to cut and we have many opportunities to improve, I don't doubt. All writing is rewriting, as they say. So one thing that I found just now reading it is that it's just a reminder that sometimes reading a story aloud can be a really valuable exercise. I definitely know this to be true from my experience as a dramatic writer. If it's your first time here, my background is in screenwriting and playwriting. I wrote a series for Audible starring Stephanie Hsu. Reading scenes aloud, reading dialogue aloud is invaluable because you just hear the rhythm, you hear if it rings true or false. You are able to perceive if this sounds like an actual scene, or if it doesn't, does it not sound like real life in the way you want? Reading aloud is critical to that practice as a dramatic writer, and it's not something that I actually instinctively do when writing prose, but that was awesome because I feel like I was able to perceive to some extent where the story dragged a little bit, and I found it dragging here when we came into the butcher shop. And I think, let me just talk about why I think that is, because essentially what that paragraph is doing is explicating, there's a little bit of explication there around the power of these cursed knives, these cheap plastic pumpkin carving knives. But we've already done that because we did that in the paragraph prior when we described all the various things that happen to people. And there's kind of a letdown after you've heard about how these magical knives cut some kid's finger off, something unspeakable happened with a caterpillar costume, there was a double murder, and then we get to pre-cut steaks and some dead mice. I like the specificity and the vividness of mice that have their throats slit. I like the understatement of this last sentence. Every year the knives grew sharper. But at the end of the day, this is a contest piece. This is horror. This is pulp. We gotta roll. So I think that this paragraph as a whole is a good place to cut, especially since I need to cut 123 words here. So off the bat, I'm just going to cut this paragraph. What else do we have to work with here? I kept saying, when I read it, I wanted to say the word much here. The streets are much darker now. It's less subtle, but there was a cadence thing that when I was reading it aloud, I heard that word come in. So I'm just going to throw that in off the bat. Because this is a contest, because this is short fiction, because I am looking to make a mark with this story, an impression from the jump, I'm going to interrogate this first sentence a little bit. The first sentence currently reads, after the incident with the Kelly twins, Mark Holman, a 57-year-old butcher, tried to have Halloween banned in his normally sleepy town of Landon, Connecticut. This is interesting. Incident with the Kelly twins, that asks a question. We have a quickly drawn small town character. So first sentence is kind of situating us into the type of story this is, small town horror. We're dealing with a Halloween origin story, so I think the handshake is working. What I don't like here is Sleepy Town. That's on some, we can do better than that, folks. That is boring, and it is familiar and tired. So given what's about to happen, and because I'm all about trying to be as specific as possible with my word choice here and not any shorthand, like Sleepy Town of Landon, Connecticut is both kind of familiar, but it's also a shorthand. Sleepy Town, that immediately has connotations. My own taste, my own vibe, my own aesthetic wants something more specific, and it's not worth getting into all that into this video. But if we take that as our premise, what is an alternative? I'm going to put atrocity-free town, because what follows this sentence is the description of an atrocity to boys knifing each other to death. More specific, and I think it makes for a catchier, compelling first sentence. Keep going. The Kelly twins had knifed each other to death with cheap plastic pumpkin carving knives. Loving the cheap plastic pumpkin carving knives, specific, unique, novel, fun, surprising. It's not a giant cleaver, it's something small. Typically something that you would even allow your 9-year-old to use, maybe because it's just a cheap plastic pumpkin carving knife. I'm excited about that. What I'm noticing, however, is that the Kelly twins, we've repeated that twice, which is not the end of the world. I think that kind of rule, like, oh, don't be repetitive, is not all as bad as people make it out to be. But let's just experiment here and see, per this idea of painting a more vivid, specific picture, if we can make an adjustment. Aaron and Evan, that was the name of two twin brothers I grew up with. Aaron and Evan Kelly had knifed each other to death with cheap plastic pumpkin carving knives. I like that. I like giving them names. If we have too many named characters, we sort of forget who they are. But I think in context of this being a small town horror mini story, the more names, the merrier, because it gives us a sense of place. In small towns, everybody knows everybody's names. So I'm kind of with this. All right. Aaron and Evan Kelly had knifed each other to death with cheap plastic pumpkin carving knives. We're in. Horror story. Let's go. Those boys had been at each other since the womb, so while everyone thought the deaths were horrific, most were not entirely surprised. This is kind of a loose sentence in a bad way. It kind of has that shorthand nature of Sleepy Town. Those boys had been at each other since the womb. But here I think is There's a voice and tone that evokes the folksiness of a small town that I think works. Sleepy Town just feels boring to me, whereas this, like, those boys have been at each other since the womb. Something that an uncle in this town has said about his nephews, Aaron and Evan. So I'm gonna hang with that. And now we introduce our Holman again. Holman is our kind of personal point of view in this story, but Holman, who had been using the very same brand and model of carving knife in his butcher shop for a decade, knew the knives were marked and knew that some malevolent force had not only instigated the double murder, but also redirected his son, little Tim's carving hand, which had been moving towards his jack-o'-lantern's mouth, to his finger, which he severed off. Woo! Wow, good thing the writer of the story was here to direct you in that reading, because that sentence is confusing on the page. I think we're definitely going to need to split this up into two sentences. I'm also keen to investigate this part of the sentence. Knew the knives were marked and knew that some malevolent force. Essentially, I could use one or the other of those. Knew that some malevolent force, knew the knives were marked. We can delete either of them and the basic meaning continues. Do we gain something from having these two different articulations in which the way the knives are cursed? Maybe, but especially since this sentence is already woefully long, I'm going to consider getting rid of one of them. What do we do here? Knew the knives were marked. I kind of like marked. Marked seems a little more subtle and evocative than malevolent, which I am not mad about explicitly identifying evil objects in a story this short. Marked, I like it. That's my instinct, so I'm going to trust my instinct here. And that also could be a end of that sentence, allowing us to break this into two sentences. So, but Holman, who had been using the very same brand and model of carving knife in his butcher shop for a decade, knew the knives were marked. He knew, a little alliterative rhetoric here, he knew that they had not only instigated, is that the right verb? Instigated. I like the idea that the knives had agency. So I wonder if there's something a little more anthropomorphic that we can use here, a little less clinical than instigated. I'm going to come back to that. He knew that they had not only instigated the double murder, but also redirected his son, little Tim's carving hand from, look at that, from, omit needless words, his jack-o'-lantern's mouth to his finger, which he then severed off. These are intuitive decisions that just come from years of writing, but I think that if we were to unpack them, what we're seeing here is opportunities to reframe the structure of these sentences so that they are more efficiently told. The then, that is again kind of like this instinct around much. It's kind of a rhythmic instinct. And what happened when he delivered a roast to the Perkins home while Grace Perkin was trying on her caterpillar costume? Well, it was unspeakable. I'm dubious of, well, it was unspeakable. There's kind of this, all of a sudden, the speaker of the story is here, the narrator, and it's kind of like, where did you come from? And why are you so casual? But let's roll with it. Let's roll with it for now. What I'm also concerned about in this sentence is the absence of aforementioned knives. Do we need them? I don't know. I think that maybe we want inclusion of them subtly or explicitly so that we are crystal clear that this also is a result of the knives, that some tragedy, some unspeakable tragedy happened with the knives, with Grace Perkin and her caterpillar costume. This, by the way, it was unspeakable. This is like a cool kind of strategy of saying, well, you're going to have to imagine what happened because it was really bad, which I've been learning about by reading tons of horror stories recently. If you're new to the channel, there's a story club on this channel. My friend and I, Sarah, are working our way through this anthology of horror short stories, and that is a little mini literary tactic that I continue to see over and over again in those stories. So let's see. I think that what I want to do with that is, let me think. Okay. While Grace Perkin held one of the carving knives while trying on her caterpillar costume, well, it was unspeakable. Might revisit that, but for the sake of this exercise, I think that is a significant improvement. Moving down. After Holman made such a fuss, do we care? Some folks stopped coming to his shop. Well, I do like the fact that he's being distanced. This is kind of an emotional thing that's happening to our character. But he stayed in business, and the next year he waited with dread as Halloween approached. So this is cool, I think, because, so we lost this idea that he confessed to the mayor. Okay, so we need this part of the story. We need this part of the story that he went to the mayor. So I'm just going to undo that change, as you just saw. These are the details that were slowing us up, and I explained why before. Let's keep this. Holman confessed to the mayor that for years he'd known that the inordinately sharp carving knives, which he inexplicably, typo, managed to cleave grisly stew meat with, held dark energy. Dark energy? Yeah. After Holman made such a fuss, some folks stopped coming to the shop. You know what? Let's be more clear. I want to be crystal clear in this story and keep a through line that's aggressive and tight and propulsive. Let's engage with the events of the story that immediately precede this, which is to say he confessed to the mayor. Cause and effect. He confessed to the mayor. The mayor denied his request. That's what I'm going to change this to. The mayor denied his request, but he stayed in business. Let's get rid of this. The next year, he waited with dread. Cool. Main character talking about how they're afraid. This makes us afraid. This is the basic concept of horror writing. We're explicitly talking about the fear now, which isn't always the most elegant, but we're approaching the end of the story. I think we've earned the right to start using words like fear, dread, etc. Here we go. The mayor denied his request. The next year, let's get a subject in there again. Holman waited with dread as Halloween approached. He'd long thrown out his own set of knives, but at the dollar store, he saw mothers and children plucking them off the rack by the handful. I like that. That's vivid. That's concrete. He didn't dare stop them. Do I need this sentence? He didn't dare stop them, but he stayed up night after night, wishing he had. So it's like he doesn't like the fact that these people, his towns, his neighbors, are taking these dangerous objects off the shelf. Is there a more efficient way to articulate this? I think there is. Let's get rid of this. He'd long thrown out his own set of knives, but at the dollar store, he anxiously, fearfully, let's roll first instinct here. We can always revisit. Anxiously watched as mothers and children plucked, make our grammar consistent, them off the rack by the handful. Then on Halloween, he found one of his old knives under his pillow. There's no explanation for this. This is just kind of like, ooh, spooky thing happened. I think we can run with it here. He took it and held it the way he did when the twins had come into his shop looking for fresh ground sausage. The wheels are starting to turn. If you're a consumer of horror, already by the time you're at the end of this sentence, you're starting to put it together. Actually, this dude murdered all these people. He's the one responsible. So we need to get to the end of this little section quickly because the good readers already caught up and we're writing for good readers. All right. He took it and held it the way he did when the twins had come into his shop looking for fresh ground sausage. The way he held it when he had helped little Tim with the jack-o'-lantern smile. Let's make this shorter. The way he held it when he helped his son. I like revisiting all three of the instances for the kind of parallelism there. But yes, as I said, let's get to that end. As he stabbed himself, new information. The story is transforming. Great. We're back ahead of our reader. He thought, as he had with Grace, recalling the woman with the caterpillar costume, that butterflies are so much more beautiful than caterpillars. Typo. For the record, I normally turn off autocorrect because it's distracting, but it's on here to show everything. As he had with the butterflies are so much more beautiful than caterpillars. So this is the first inclusion of the noun butterflies in this story, sort of out of left field. It's kind of a type of image that's lovely, that's light, that's poetic. Connotes derangement here, that butterflies are so much more beautiful than caterpillars. I think I can do better here. This hits the mark. The beat of kind of like deranged dude losing his marbles is achieved here. I think there's a tighter way of doing it, but I think I'm going to figure that out on my own time. They didn't ban Halloween in Landon, but they banned jack-o'-lanterns. The streets are much darker now. I think that plays. Idle. Oof, gosh, this is tough, y'all. I'm gonna have to think on this. I kind of like the idea of evoking this. Well, I have a couple thoughts, like evoking the small townness There's like a vague campness in this story. The fact that we have these like plastic carving knives, there's like echoes of kind of like a 80s, 90s situation, I think, with the emphasis on plastic. I wonder if there's a way to kind of summon that, which I also think would play well in context of Halloween origin story, thinking back to like the OG slashers. There's kind of vibes of that here. I wonder what I can do with it. You know what? Let's just, for now, I'm going to go the Butcher of Landon. We have a play on butcher. Butcher as in killer. Butcher is the occupation of the title. There's something like, again, this 80s pulp situation, the Butcher of Landon, Connecticut. Let's get the whole thing in. The Butcher of Landon, Connecticut. I'm not mad at that. That's serviceable. We'll see if it sticks. Word count. Oh my God, 313 words. Yikes. Holy mackerel. Okay. Jeez. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. We need to get aggressive. 75 words. Holy mackerel. Okay. I'll figure it out, y'all. I'll figure it out and get back to you. Here's a fun idea. In the comments, what would you do? What would you do if you had to chop 75 words out of this little guy? Where would you chop? Bye.